Alright, I'm going to start back up then. So we went over part 1 here, which was how the web works, and how ASP.NET MVC fits into this. So I'm going to start going over part 2 here. I'm going to go over the first, I don't know, 2, 3, or 4 parts and go over chapter 1 today also. Alright? So, it says we've discussed enough theory, now it's time to get our hands dirty. And again, there's a couple things to realize here. It says we're going to create a mini internet movie application database like IMDB. This is nothing like IMDB. All right? What IMDB is it's a full-fledged website that allows you to go and search for TV movies, movies that have been, out to the screen, etc. What we're going to do is it's like imagine a snowflake in a snowstorm. That's kind of what we're doing. All right. So it says again, a couple things about this. They're assuming you're using 2013. There are projects like this out on Microsoft.com as well. I could have used one of those. All right. But what I want to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to basically just follow their lead. So I'm going to start up a new version or a new instance of Visual Studio. All right, I'm going to go to create a new project. You can do this even if you've got 2017. All right, again, your screens are going to look different. All right, so I'm going to come down here to where it says ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework. All right, and then going back here, it says select the empty template, and we're going to call this, I can't remember what we're going to call it. They don't tell you in here what to call it. They just use it later as though you've called it that. So I'm just going to follow their lead for now. All right. So it says fire this up, select file, new project. ASP just did all that. Select empty template, selecting this. They want you to call this Hello World V1. Fine, then that's what I'm going to do. All right. So Hello World V1. So they want this to be Hello World V1. Remember that by default, all right, it's going to save the solution as the same name as the project. And whatever you had been saving things in for your default directory will be your default. I'm just going to save virtually all of my stuff to the desktop. So you may have to click over here, click the browse button to change yours so it's the same. The framework should be fine the way it is. I'm going to click create. And I believe they tell us to create an empty project with MVC. Let's double check. Select the empty template. Select the MVC checkbox. Again, ours looks different. This is the way it looked in 2017 pretty much as well. But in 2019, it looks different. All right. We will get almost this exactly identical folder structure. So again, I'm selecting empty and making sure MVC is checked. And then I'm going to click create. Now you saw me do this before because I did that empty project for you before. All right, I could have waited and done it now, but I just wanted to be able to compare and contrast what you get with an empty project versus a non-empty project. All right. So this is what they show in the book. This is what we have here. And what you'll notice if we take a look here, should be able to bring them both up. Is we've got virtually the same thing. So that hasn't really changed very much. Now, if you can say it's not identical, it may not be, but it's very similar. What I want to do in here is I want to show you a few things, some of which I've touched on, some of which I haven't touched on yet. All right? As we get going in here and we start to bring the database component into here, one of the things that you'll notice is right now, these are references. So these are all things that we have the ability to use in here. But right up near the top, what you're going to see soon is it's going to say system.entity framework. And the entity framework is a way, and it's pretty much the primary way that you use databases with virtually anything Microsoft. All right, that's a generalization, but it pretty much holds true. All right, so you've got those references. App data is a place where you can put your databases in there. All right, and I think we talked about that a little bit last semester. If I go to app start, you'll notice there's a single file in here that's called route config. This file, and I don't expect all of this to make a whole heck of a lot of sense right now, all right? But this file says right now, this is where you register your routes. So if you want the system to go someplace, automatically you register the routes in here. All right, again, I'm not even asking if that makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And I'm putting this over a few lines so you can see all of it. This says that by default, again, unless told otherwise, this says we want to use a home controller. Even if we don't have one made, that doesn't matter. That by default, it's going to use a home controller. By default, it's going to bring up the index method for the home controller. And it's possible that we can have parameters that we pass into this. But you'll notice the .optional means we don't have to. All right. What a lot of MVC is it's a big routing mechanism. All right. So for lack of better words, I mean, imagine it's an airport, a train station, or whatever, and it has to make sure when planes or trains or whatever come in, they're coming in on the right track or on the right runway, etc. And if planes are going out, they're doing it the same way. That's kind of what we're doing here. All right, not the best analogy, but it's the one I'm using. All right. And again, the other stuff in here, I already explained to you what controllers are. I already explained to you what models are. I already explained to you what views are. All right. What you're going to find as we end up going on in here, we're going to come up here, for example, and we're going to right mouse click and we're going to choose and create a new folder called content. In that content folder, we will put in all of our Bootstrap CSS files and our CSS files will go in there. All right. We'll have another folder down here that'll hold our JavaScript, etc. So you're going to see all that stuff. If you remember, one of the things I told you last semester was in some ways this class is a hybrid of the first two classes you took. So it is expected that from the first class you understand website design, how to create websites. All right. From the second class, it's expected that not only did you have that introduction like we did to databases, but you know how to write C# code. Because that's pretty much what we're doing in this class, is combining these two. So again, they do explain, as I just did, what's in here. I guess the one or two things that I didn't explain that I'd like to quickly mention is, notice there's a file here called WebConfig and there's a file here called WebConfig. They're not the same file. This file allows you to set up website configurations that are basically only used in the views folder, so by your views. This file allows you to go in and set up configurations website wide. All right. And this file, global.asax, that file runs at the beginning of the program. Okay, that file runs at the beginning of the program. Plus, what you'll see as we go on, this will be very late in the course, but we'll do what's called packaging, where we take all of our JavaScript files and kind of smash them together, and the same thing with our CSS files. All right? So why am I telling you that? That's basically what ends up getting put in the packages.config file. All right? So I didn't go over maybe 100% of what's in here, but you've at least heard a little bit about most of what's in there. Now, again, there's no way in heck I can expect that you're going to remember all that. And I don't. All right? But the more you're introduced to it, the more you work with it, ideally at least, the more it'll make sense. All right? I mean, when you think about it, in the end, that's pretty much about all I can hope for. All right? So it says in here, there is a small change the author added to the flow. They added action blocks. What the heck does that mean? All right. The controller is a class. Remember from last semester in C# when we did classes? And we said classes contain what? They contain properties and they contain methods. What's a method? A method is a function inside of a class. These actions that you see in here are methods. So what they will do is they will say, when we do something in our controller, what do you want to have happen? All right. For instance, it might be pressing a button. It might be choosing a menu option. It might be something else. But that's what they're talking about here. So for instance, I might have, I don't know, a drop-down menu that when I bring up a certain table will allow me to either add a record, update a record, or delete a record, something like that. That would be 3 different actions. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, that's 3 different things we want to have happen. All right, and that's what they discuss in here. It says we're going to discuss how each of these blocks and steps work as we go on. All right, each of these components would be discussed in brief and will be explained in detail in later chapters. You are not going to walk out of going through these 12 things that are in here. And if you looked at it that this is a journey, so to speak, your ASP journey, you'll have taken a couple steps. That's it. All right. So they talk about the route config. I already mentioned it to you. Again, I want to use my own words because otherwise I find that I'm just reading from a screen, and I don't know what good that does you. You could do that just as well yourselves. So they explain in some depth and breadth of coverage right here. All right. This is part 2, about halfway down, what's going on in here. And what are they saying? Well, first of all, what do we notice? Public class. So it's a class file. It's called route config. What is this? This is the one method that's inside of that class. All right? Well, what kind of method is it? It's a static method. We talked about all this stuff last semester. All right. If it's a static method, that means that it can be just called basically, and since it's public, from anybody. You don't have to create a new instance of a class. You don't have to do anything. This is called automatically, and I'll show you where it is called in just a minute, to register the routes. All right. So it comes in here. I don't want to go through this right now because it'd be too confusing. But this is basically defining, again, our default route. So it's saying, unless told otherwise, this is the path it wants you to take. All right. As we go on in here, we will add other routes into a file like this. All right. And in fact, I should show you that, I guess. Okay. I mentioned there was this route config. That's the file that's up right now. Then I said there's this file called global ASAX.cs. Well, what is that? It's the file that runs at the beginning of the program. All right. And areas we don't cover till later on in the course, but notice it says when the program starts to call that file, to call that method that I just showed you. So that's setting up the routing structure. And again, there's the author's explanation. Is it better than mine? Is it worse than mine? I don't know. So what this says is these are defaults. So if you're not given the name of a controller, use home. If you're not given the name of an action, use index. And why is that important? Well, what that means, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to run one of these that I had earlier to show you this. And I got to run the full one. Let's see. So I'm going to run this. And when you look at it, all it's going to say is localhost. That's it. All right. It's going to come up in just a second. It's going to run. All right. This said use all the defaults. So in other words, look on the screen, please. I'm going to put in here /home. And I'm going to hit enter. And nothing changed. Nothing changed because by default it was told to use the home controller. So that's what it did. All right. And I can come in here and I can put in /index and hit enter. And nothing happens. Because by default, it used the defaults I'd set up, or the system setup. The default controller, which was home, and the default method, which was index. All right. So notice if I come through here, and I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to go over to controllers and I'm going to add a new controller. All right. I can make it, you know what, I can even make it with views. It doesn't matter what it, because I'm not going to keep this anyway. All right. So I want to stay in here. My model class, it doesn't really matter. I'll use route config. That should be fine. My data class, I don't think it's going to give me anything in there. All right, so yeah, it's going to do the same thing. What I want to get across to you is if I come in here, create another controller, and run the program from that controller, I'm going to get an error message. And the reason I'm going to get an error message is that that does not exist inside of here. So every time I go in and create a new controller, either I've got to figure out a way to have the system enter that into this file for me, or I have to manually enter it. You're going to see all that as we go on. The other thing to notice too, if you would look on the screen here, notice there's 2 more files here. That's what I got because I chose, you know, show me all that. Basically, I didn't ask for an empty project. It's got bundle config, so there it's bundling up from our scripts folder. That holds all of our JavaScript and jQuery files. All right, that says bundle them. What does that mean? Anybody know what minify, what it means when you minify files? You actually all should, because remember when we chose jQuery, how we chose the minified version? And when you looked at it, it looked like it was all squished together because it removed any unnecessary white space. You can do the same thing with your JavaScript files. You can do the same thing with your CSS files. You can minify all those. Why would you want to minify them? That's a part of it, but going along with that, yes, it saves space, but since it's smaller, it loads faster. All right, so your program will load faster, so for performance reasons, you oftentimes do that. All right. And we also have in here a filter config. All right, which can be used for, among other things, to handle error conditions. All right. Remember earlier I showed you this file, that layout. There's also another file that gets created when you do it this way. It's called error.cshtml. Why would you want that? Well, if a user gets to a page they shouldn't be at, this is the thing that will automatically come up. You can make one generic error page, or you can make any, error pages for everything that can possibly happen. And just like I explained to you, localhost versus localhost followed by like home, index, etc. And they give you some other examples as well. All right, so the next thing they want us to do is to right mouse click on the controller folder, add a controller, an empty one, and call it home. This is the kind of thing, again, you're going to have to get used to doing this sooner rather than later. All right, so I'm going to right mouse click on my controllers folder. I'm going to choose add. I'm going to use controller. I'm going to choose empty. Click add, and they want us to call this home controller. Remember, looking on the screen here, when I do this, two things are going to happen. First, in here, it's going to make a file called homecontroller.cs. Second, it's going to take, and in my views, it's going to make a folder, but it's not going to call it home controller. It just calls it home. And since I made it an empty controller, that folder will be empty. All right? So there's home controller. There's my empty home folder. Now, one of the reasons, I'm not trying to bore anybody or anything else, but one of the reasons that I'm going through and doing it like this is when we get to the point where we're creating projects, I'm going to expect you can all do this. I say go in there, create these 3 controllers, etc. You're just going to be able to do it. All right? All right, so let's talk about what's in here. In fact, let's look at this file and see if it's the same as our file. All right. And again, I can't say this to you too many times. First of all, it's the first day back. All right, and I get that. So if you say, yeah, you're throwing a lot of garbage at us, I'm not going to remember hardly any of this. Hey, we're just starting, and that's all I want you to realize. All right. So look at this. The first thing you'll notice here that what we have here that we don't have here are these using statements. All right. Those are provided for us automatically. All right, and it's going to allow us to use a lot of those references that we had in here. So what do we realize about this? Does everybody notice how numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 are gray? Can you see that? That means that currently they are not being used. So if I don't want them there, I can click on the little light bulb and say, no, not that. Hold on. So I can click on the light bulb here and say, remove unnecessary usings. And it does. Notice what's still there. This program to work needs the system.web.mvc. It needs that reference. So there's something that's in there that our program needs. All right? So let's look at what else is there. All right. So we've got namespace. Can I move that over a little bit? Namespace, hello world, controller. Well, what does that mean? All right. Does everybody realize these two things virtually look the same? All right. So let me go back, and I'll just use this one. That's fine. What this means is the namespace is saying what we want to do is go to your project, hello world v1, go to the controllers folder, and underneath that, you're going to find this. That's what it's saying. That's what the namespace means. It's a path, so to speak, to where you currently are. All right? Now it says, okay, what we have in here is we have a class that's called home controller. That's the one we just made. This means home controller inherits from controller. Every controller that you create will have that colon controller on the end of it. They all inherit from the controller class. That's a built-in ASP.NET class that allows for certain things to be able to happen automatically. All right. Notice what it says here. Anybody remember what the opposite of get is? No. Well, yeah, wrong language, but yes, you're right. Put. Remember when you're doing, when you are working on a website and you do a get, that means that the information is going to be stored up in the address bar. It'll have like an ampersand and all that stuff. All right, but if you do a put, it won't be. All right. All right. So what this means is we're doing a get, and a get is like a select statement that we used to do in databases. What do I mean? I mean you're not changing anything. You're getting something. Devin walks into class first day. What's your name? Devin. Okay, that's a get name. I can't change it. So I don't like your name. Call yourself something else. I mean, I could say that. I don't know if you do it or not, but all right. So what this is saying is, this is the index method. Okay? So in other words, right now, if we were to come in here and put in a file right there that was called index.cshtml, that's the file that would be called from here. Does that make sense? Now, I could come in here, I could right mouse click and do that, or I can just come over here and I can be anywhere in here. I always try to be on the Word. Right mouse click and I can choose Add View. It calls it index. It's empty. I click Add, and there it is. Not there, but there it is. Okay? All right. Okay, as it says, if you use the scaffolding, things will be written for you, okay? It says, instead of returning action result, what the hell is this? I love that. We'll discuss this later. I'm going to return a string. So what they want us to do is this. This before said action result. What that meant was, since it said action result, it meant go out and find a CS/HTML file with that name and run the file. All right? But what they want us to do is change it to string, and it should return hello world, excited to see my first controller in action. You know, it's like this is, like I said, this is kind of a waste, but we're doing it anyway. So I'm going to come in here, okay, and all this stuff that we were working on here in our home controller, we're going to change this to a string. Oops. And we're going to change that return statement that was in here to this. Hello world, excited to see my first controller in action. Does it make sense to you that when I run this, if it works correctly, what should happen is what I should see on my screen, if I run this routine, what I should see on my screen is just a message on the screen that says, hello world, ... excited to see my first controller in action. Does that make sense? All right. Now, I'm going to save this, and I'm going to run it. I want to see if that happens. Again, it picks out a random port. There it is. Now, just to show you this, all right, and for right now you might say, yeah, you showed us that. Why would you want to do this? It'll make more sense later, but I want to show you one other thing, okay? And that is, if I kept this the way it was, so if this said action result right here, this, if this said action result index, and I wanted to run this file, all right, I could go to that file and click start, or I can just right mouse click on the file and say view in browser. That's going to become more important when we go later. It allows you to basically run your program faster than having to click the button here. Okay? All right. So as it says, what happened here? That's exactly what we saw, the port number and this, right? Okay, so what has happened? Okay, when you run the application, you've got a URL, etc., port number may vary. Yeah, the request with the URL reaches the routing engine. As we have not supplied the name of a controller, we didn't. It took the default, which was home, and it took the default, which was index. All right? So, as an example, I think this is going to work, but we're going to try it anyways, whether it does or not. I'm going to come in here, and where we have this home controller. All right? I'm going to put in another method. Let's say public string hello. And I'm just going to put in here return hi, how you doing? All right, just that. Okay, it's fine. There's nothing. There are no errors in here. If there were errors, I'd see some red marks, etc. But the problem is, when I've got this and I run the program, how many of you think it's going to come up and say, hi, how you doing? Anybody? Well, it doesn't. This basically did all the defaults, so it did home, which gives you the same thing, which did index, which was the default, which did the same thing. But what if I come in there and I type in hello? Oops, not hello. See that? So I've got control, no pun intended, but with my controller, I can have as many methods in a controller as I want to have. All right? Depending on, I mean, some controllers are very simple. They just do one or two things. Some are very, very complex when they do a lot of things. But what I want you to get from this is when we do this, it's running all the defaults. So since I never listed in here home, index, hello, since I didn't list that in my route.config, I have to specify that myself. All right? Either I have to specify it like this, or I have to call it from within my program. It's not smart enough to be able to pick that up itself. Well, that was neat. Oh, it's because I put index in there. Great. All right. So as I said, they explain in here what I'm trying to show you. All right? And they mention a couple things. There are a couple things to note here. Number one, all right, we use the controller for everything so far. We haven't made a model. I made that view, but I didn't have to. I made that view earlier that didn't put anything in. So the author says, let's go on and talk view. I'll tell you what, I'll go till 2:45. We'll take another break. All right? So, part 3 in here, views in ASP.NET, MVC application, and Razor. All right? Do you remember earlier, looking on the screen here, that I mentioned to you, let me go down into my view, that this is called Razor code. All right? What you can do with Razor code is you can basically take anything that you've ever learned in C# and put it inside of an HTML file. Now, if you went and created a bunch of classes, etc., and put them in here like this, that would be stupid. All right? What you typically put in here, as far as your C# is just very simplistic type of code. All right? Or code that needs to be shared among the application. Okay? Like I said, there's some stuff in here we're going to talk about. You probably or may not, unless you've done a little reading, have any idea what ViewBag is. And it's not really that important a thing. This, everybody should know. No big thing there. All right, so the author says, in the last chapter, what did we do? We built a simple Hello World application. It says now it's time to get started on our application, Micro IMDB. All right, which is, as it says, we're trying to replicate this. What we will be able to do in here is what they show here. You will be able to get a list of movies. All right, what movies? The ones that we put in. All right, and we'll be able to search for movies by either name or actor. I want everybody to realize we're in part 3 here of 12. Anybody disagree with this? They haven't mentioned databases in here once. Everybody agree with that? So when we create our data, when we first create our data in here, we're not going to create it as a database. We're going to create it as an HTML table. We're going to use it as though it was a database, but it won't be a database. We'll create the database in a later lesson. All right? So the author says, fire up Visual Studio, select. So what I'm going to do is I've already got this thing in here. And this is called Hello World V1. Okay? And that's fine. I'm not going to do anything else with it, at least for now, maybe never. So I'm going to close all these files. I'm going to come up to my solution here. I'm going to right mouse click on the solution and choose Add New Project. All right. So this is the first, one of the first times at least, where we've seen where we're creating a solution with multiple projects in it. All right. So again, I'm going to come in here. Notice now I can go down here like I've been doing and choose ASP.NET Web Application Net Framework. But hopefully you've got this too, that since we've already created those, it's up here. Now, if it doesn't show on yours, it should eventually. All right. So I'm going to I'll choose it from there. It doesn't matter, and choose Next. Okay. And this will be micro IMDB V1. I would suggest you call yours the same thing because later on in a later lesson, they create micro IMDB V2. Okay? This is the one where I think they don't even tell you what to call it. All of a sudden later it's got a name, and I think this was the right name. All right? It's not a real big thing one way or the other. Notice a couple things from here. It knows where to save it, and it knows the framework. It's not asking me in here what solution I want to use because I'm already inside of a solution. So I'm creating a file, I'm creating a project inside of an existing solution. All right. So I'm just going to say create. I think they want this to be an empty MVC, but let's double check. Select MVC5 controller, empty, and click add. Yes. All right. So we're going to do the controller in just a second. All right, so empty, MVC, and click create. All right, and that gives me what you see in front of you here. All right, again, I do want you to realize, if you look up on the screen, please, I have no file in here. No file. I open up my views. I have no file in this project right now that has an extension on it of .cs HTML, which means I can't run this program right now because the system won't have any startup type of file. All right. So again, they told me to come in here and create an empty controller, and we're going to call it movie controller. So I'm going to come in here, right mouse click on my controllers folder, choose add, choose controller, choose empty, click add, and change this to movie. think they do it singular and not plural. Yeah. Again, you should never remove that name. I mean, if you accidentally did and typed in controller again, it wouldn't hurt anything. But your controllers should always end with the word controller. All right? So if we did this correctly, this is what should come up. Looks very similar to what we saw in the last example. All right? Except the namespace will be changed, the name of the controller is changed, but the stuff that's in here is the same as what we saw previously. So click Add, and there you see it. Again, notice these are all gray. All right? I don't care if you keep those in there and leave them gray, or you click the light bulb and remove what you don't want. When we go on and we get a little further in here, you'll be adding things into here that are not there right now. We'll do things like that are called like data annotations, which means that when we set up a database, we can give it, if we set up a database, let's say that was for Rankin Technical College, and we had a field called grades, we could set it up so the only permissible values were A, B, C, and F, something like that. All right, that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at. So again, the only using statement we need, our namespace, we are in the micro IMDB V1 project. We are in the controllers folder. The name of the controller is movie controller, and it inherits from the controller class. So right now, this is all that's in it by default. Since we now have an empty movie views movie folder, but we don't have any files in it, if I save this and I run the program, it should still fail. Because again, I don't have a start file. Oh, it is running because it's running the other one. All right. Okay. Says there's a few things to note in the code above. All controllers derive from the controller base class. I already said that. Our movie controller also derived from system.web.mvc. Well, that was inside of here, it's got a class inside of MVC that's called controller. All right, that's why we need this using statement. The name of the controller should always end with the word controller. Yeah. The index action method generated for you automatically returns an action result. Not to be funny, but an action result is the result of an action. And it can be the result of whatever action, that you need to be able to provide, or you need to provide code for. As it says, it can also be used to return HTML. So it can return anything from an HTML file to JSON. We'll look at JSON later. Anyone know what JSON stands for? JavaScript Object Notation. Do you remember that when we were working first semester and we were in the AWD1111 class, we got into working on JavaScript? It was near the end of the semester, and I gave you about a day where I went over the last chapters in the book. And one of those chapters was the chapter on object-oriented programming. Well, a lot of the work you do in JavaScript object-oriented programming, you work with JSON. All right? It is a way that you can work with data that looks very similar to using JavaScript in an object-oriented way. Okay? All right. So it says in the last chapter, we just changed that, what we had in here, that action result, we changed it to a string, and we put return and whatever that stuff was that we had in there. It's no big thing. It says now we don't want to do that. Now we want to create a view, okay, very similar to what I showed you before. All right, so let's see if we can do this. So I'm going to come in here, right mouse click inside of my index, choose Add View. You can see that by default, it's got the name of wherever it was you clicked. If you don't like that name, you can always change it. All right? And notice that by default it's got empty without model. Notice what else is in here. If I was going to use this to create something, I might choose the create template, delete the delete template, etc. All right, I'm not doing anything special with this. I'm not using a model, so I've got empty. All right, and so notice how this is grayed out. If I change this to just empty, notice how that is no longer grayed out. But I don't want to have it with a model. I want it just like that. All right. What we will get into later, into a later chapter, not in this section, but when we get into the book in a little bit later chapter, we'll talk about what are referred to as partial views. And it's a view that can be shared. Okay? It can make the amount of code we write, it can lessen it up, for lack of better words. Now, since we're not doing anything special and it's just empty, we don't even have this reference script libraries. All right, so we won't even worry about that. This use a layout page, all right, notice it's checked and there's nothing in there. I think everybody can see that. If we wanted to, we could click here and have our own layout page for this. All right, right now, since it's checked, it'll automatically use the one that's built for us down in here. All right, so I'm going to click Add. And now notice inside of movie, I have an index file. That file is this file. What does it do? By default, a couple things. It gives me a title, all right, and it puts an H2 tag in there. That's it. Not very much. All right, but I asked for it to be empty with no model. That's why it looks the way it does. Well, this is going to be interesting because I should have unchecked that and I didn't. Tell you what I'm going to do. When I made this, I should have unchecked this. Show you real quick what I'm going to do. I'm going to remove what I just created. I'm going to delete that and I'm going to recreate it. So I'm going to right mouse click in here, choose Add View like we just did. Everything the same, but I'm going to uncheck Use a Layout Page and click Add. Now look what it does. It's weird. It's like, wait a minute, I said I didn't want a layout page, so it's giving me a layout page. No, it's giving me some default code. That's what it's doing. It's saying there is no layout, and I don't think there's anything in here that should have to be explained to you. All right. Again, CS HTML is the extension. That means it's an HTML file which can include C# or what's referred to when you put C# in an HTML file is Razor code. All right. All right, so that's what we got. It says run the application. All right, so let's do that. Always a good idea to do a file, save all. I will tell you, more than anything we did last semester, sometimes when you build an application like this, you do something that makes it go flaky. So at least if you've saved, all right, if you end up having to reboot or whatever, you've got whatever you've done thus far. It's still running that first one that we created earlier. All right. So now, though, I can come down to my movie thing. I can click on here. I can right mouse click and say View in Browser. And guess what? That's it. Why does it look like that? Not all at once. It looks like that because look at the code. What do we have in the body? Nothing. An empty div. So that's what gets presented on the screen. All right. They want us to go and make these changes. This seems like a good time to break. All right, I know it hasn't been that long since you had your last one, but it's 242. Let's come back at about 252, please.